Hello and welcome to episode 123 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are finally done with online Call of Duty for the season. The CDL season is wrapping up. The online portion has wrapped up, and we only have one more major before the Call of Duty League Championship to signify the end of the season. So we'll talk about the final batch of online matches that happened this weekend. Plus, we will preview Major 4, the final major of the 2024 CDL season. And we have a lot to talk about. This last week of online matches gave us a lot of storylines to really follow and to analyze before we get to Major 4. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. Like you said, online MW3 CDL action is officially over. And now we got one more LAN this week to round up the regular season and champs after that. So quickly coming to an end here, but I am definitely thankful that the online portion of the season is finally over. We've been talking about that for a while now. It's kind of dragged on these qualifier matches, just taking 4 or 5 weeks at a clip before getting to LAN action. It's been a drag, but uh, it did at least this time around. It always leads to some storylines inevitably, but this time around definitely certainly had some juicy storylines. So we'll dive right into that.
Well, as Scrappy said, now we just have matches that matter. And that's kind of a shot at online Call of Duty, but it's true, especially for a team like Toronto that has, clinched a spot at champs like, more than a month ago, I think now. They've had that spot for a long time. And now the matches simply matter the most that they can possibly matter this year. We still have, I believe, 4 unclaimed spots for champs. So 4 teams. Right now, there are technically 8 teams that can make champs if they perform well enough and if things break right for them at Major 4. But still, only 4 spots remain. So there are at least going to be 4 teams that are going to be very disappointed by how things shake out. But before we get to that, let's talk about these last online matches because they really give us a good idea of how we should feel about Major 4 and going into that. Starting with Friday, June 21st, we had back-to-back Game 5s to start off the day. The first of which, Miami versus Seattle, a battle of teams vying for that 5th place spot. Obviously, neither of them have clinched a spot at champs, but they were tied for that 5th position heading in. Miami ends up, I would say, pulling off an upset. Obviously, not a huge one, but we both picked Seattle. I think most people probably thought going in that the Surge would be favored in that matchup, but the Heretics, they continue a really, really strong online qualifier. One of their strongest of the season, obviously, since that first set of qualifiers. And they win this 3-2. What did you make of Miami's win here?
I think kind of like you said, how um, comparing it to their first set of qualifiers, like it's definitely the strongest they've looked online, and we've talked about it kind of at length now, like just the effect that seemingly Rial has had since joining the team. Like obviously it wasn't immediate success, but it feels like they have only gotten better as time has progressed and he's gotten more reps with this squad. And as I have inevitably said countless times over the last few weeks, you want to be playing your best COD towards the end of the season heading into the final events, and Miami is definitely doing that, especially when you compare it to what they did on LAN in the first couple events and the online portion of the season in the middle of the season. So, yeah, definitely was one. I think, we both took Seattle for the prediction sake, but I think we both probably would say, like, if we both picked Miami, I don't think it would have, like, you know, caused a stir or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's one of those matches where you probably could have gone either way and felt like decent about either team's chances to take it. It's just one Miami was able to clutch up in, and yeah, I mean that's obviously a big win for them heading into the major and their own pursuit of a champ spot. Both those teams are kind of in like uh, the position of that. Well, they're in fifth, sixth spot, but they're at the highest point of those teams that are
Hmm.
still fighting for a spot. And I said that terribly,
Yeah.
but
They
um,
they're in an advantageous position, at least compared to some of these other teams that are, they need something to happen to the other teams in front of them.
yes.
Right now, if Miami and Seattle take care of business, they will both get in, and they won't have to worry at all after the or during this weekend. So that's something to, I think, as we talk about these matches, I think it's good to kind of give people an idea of how the standings are now and were before these matches, because really, like, the standings is, that's what's making these online qualifiers that more interesting, and that's why earlier in the season it's hard to get excited about these qualifiers, because it's like, okay, it doesn't feel like these actually matter all that much. But as you can tell from just this match, like, those 10 points put Miami, at least momentarily, ahead of Seattle in the standings, and gave them a good position to make champs. And, obviously, Major Four seeding is also at stake as well. So a lot of things kind of at play there. Second match of the day is kind of weird that this didn't end up the ending Friday, but Atlanta versus Toronto, you know, right now, because of how things have happened with OpTic, these are the two best teams, the teams that have performed the best over the past month or so. Atlanta versus Toronto in a rematch of Major One Grand Finals, a big rivalry obviously brewing between Draza and Scrappy, and Toronto ends up winning this in Game Five. As I said, back-to-back Game Fives to start off the weekend. Um, I mean, like, I don't think Atlanta played nearly as well as I expected them to, but Toronto, without a doubt, proved that they deserve a lot of praise and a lot of, like, hype going into Major Four and into champs. And, they're kind of used to this. They were kind of peaking at the end of last season as well. What did you make of Toronto beating Atlanta here?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, like heading into this week, I know for the match that happened earlier today between OpTic and Toronto, we were joking last week about like OpTic and Toronto both having struggles in S&D recently. And we're like, well, they're struggling, but somebody has to win map 2 today, right? Um, so you know, the fact that Toronto was able to win this series and do so by winning a game 5 has got to be, a little scary for Atlanta and Atlanta fans, because now you're losing an online match to Toronto after you most recently lost to them on LAN as well. So what's it going to take for Atlanta to get back over the hump? Obviously, um, Atlanta lost to them in, was it? It would have been the winners finals and the grand finals of Major One, I believe. It
Yeah, I
was
believe
definitely the
so.
grand finals, but yeah, they played them twice at Major One on LAN, lost then. Can't remember if they played when Atlanta won Major Two. Um,
I think
I feel like
I don't think so.
okay.
I'll look it up while you're talking.
Regardless, but most recently now, this is I believe their last two matches, both one on LAN and one online. Toronto has beaten Atlanta, and even this series was definitely one indicative of them being probably the two best teams at this point right now, especially taking OpTic struggles in this online qualifier into consideration. So it's a really, really hard fought series. Especially, the map 1 might be a little deceiving because Toronto heavily outplayed in that map 1, and it was only a 50-point game, but still Toronto kind of dominated that. And then the game 2 search was pretty close too, which I was surprised. And Atlanta was able to clutch up in around 11. Goes to a another round 5 control, which seems to be the norm nowadays and most of the season. Toronto takes that, but then I was kind of surprised after the high rise control. The high rise control was uh, kind of ridiculous. Excuse me. It seemed like even people were joking on the timeline and on the broadcast and stuff. I think Merck and Maven were doing this game and like joking about like the tanker over by that one point on high rise control that like blew up and it was seemingly patched several patches ago or in a recent patch, and it's been happening still where it's still blowing up even though it wasn't supposed to. But it might have been like a team need from Celium or something. I don't know. There was some like there were several team kills that happened that seemingly could have been avoided if the tank, the infamous explosion tank there on high rise wasn't going off, and Toronto capitalized on that to take that game. So after that, it was going into a sub base hard point, which I don't know. Toronto's record on it now. All I do remember is Toronto was undefeated on it before playing OpTic on it twice at Major 3. And OpTic won those times when they played against them. But regardless, Toronto has been one of the better sub-base hardpoint teams this season. Atlanta has not, and they've been testing it, and they lost it earlier in these online qualifiers, and they played it again, and they won it. I can't remember which teams it was against, but I remember they lost it, and then they won it in the same weekend in one of the earlier weekends. So Atlanta's been testing it and at least playing it in these qualifiers, trying to see if they can improve and whatnot, and then they were able to win it in what was the least close map of this entire series, so that was kind of surprising to me. And then it went to another search where Toronto is able to win after having their struggles in search, which is also surprising to me. So, all things considered, it was a pretty, very close series back and forth in many facets and many surprising elements of it all around. Uh, I just think, end of the day, right now, it's setting up that we want to see these two teams duke it out again on land, and hopefully we'll get that at Major 4.
Yeah, so I was just looking it up. Toronto is 3-0 this season against Atlanta on LAN, and that's including a 4-1 grand finals victory. So they beat them twice at Major 1, and then they beat them in the winners finals of Major 3 before OpTic ended up beating and eliminating Atlanta FaZe in the losers bracket. But this is the first time that Toronto has beaten Atlanta online this season. Atlanta was 2-0 against the Ultra heading into today. So potentially, if at Phase 1 they would have been 0-3 on LAN and 3-0 online against Toronto. Obviously, Toronto now would seem like the favorite if they end up playing again at Major 4, but these are really close series regardless. Like, it's at least the last two series have went to Game 5 between FaZe and Toronto, so I would definitely expect a really competitive series regardless if they do end up playing at Major 4 or at Champs. But yeah, I think it's surprising that Atlanta lost because, like you mentioned, Toronto had been having those struggles in Search and Destroy, just like OpTic, and I felt like that was kind of like the key to Atlanta winning this kind of series. But if Toronto's able to, and both of these searches were very close, 6-5 game 2, 6-4 game 5. I mean, that they can go either way, and Toronto proved that if they can just take one of those searches, they have a really, really good opportunity to win and beat FaZe, even though FaZe is a very, very consistently good team. They don't have a lot of weaknesses across their game, but big win for Toronto, and it kind of set up for today's match against OpTic, but we'll get there in just a little bit. Vegas versus LAT. The Thieves win this 3-1. We talked about how kind of big of a match this was for the Legion, considering they've had a few of these upsets. They were looking a lot better as of late. But they end up losing this 3-1. Any takeaways from this match here?
I mean, we were split obviously in the predictions, and I can't really recall LAT. Was it last week? LAT like played two tough teams heading into the week. Yeah, they played. Yeah, they played Toronto and FaZe, and they lost 3-1 both of those. So obviously you can say LAC went 0-2 the week heading into this one and say, oh, it's a tough week, but obviously it's a very tough week when you're playing the two top teams in the game at the moment. So taking that as a caveat, obviously LAT is able to play a team more, probably closer to their skill, or closer to them in the standings, however you want to think about it, and they're able to take care of business. Really, the only thing of note for me, Geo had a pretty nice 1v3 in the game three or game two search, but other than that, it was pretty. Vegas did convincingly win map one, but other than that, LAT dominated the series, capped off by a 50-point club in the map four on 6-star hardpoint. So yeah, you know, we'll get to LAT a little bit later, but all things considered, it was a pretty solid start to the week for them.
Yeah, they definitely needed that. They were coming in. They were at 145 CDL points, so they were right on the bubble, right around eighth place. Same with Vegas. They both needed this win. LAT ends up getting it. Let's move to Saturday, Atlanta versus Miami. I don't think either one of us have much to say. Obviously, this is an expected result. Atlanta wins 3-1, and FaZe ends up winning the search. So, I obviously Miami is not of the same caliber as Toronto, but that's, I guess, a good thing. It would be a little more concerning if they had lost High Rise Search and Destroy against the Heretics. Any thoughts on that match?
I do know. I remember after last event that High Rise Search was one that like Octane mentioned Miami was playing well on at Major 3. So it's not like, one to just completely write off that Atlanta was able to win that. But regardless, yeah, it is worth mentioning too. They lose the High Rise control here. So they did go 0-2 in control this week. That they being Atlanta, sorry. Atlanta went 0-2 in control, 0-2 on High Rise control against Toronto and Miami. So is that going to be, it feels like a lot of teams were playing high rise more so in this set of qualifiers, potentially trying to expand the map pool as we talked about over the past couple of weeks. So is that going to be something maybe we see Atlanta go back to Invasion? I feel like that's probably what they've played a lot more, or Karachi. Obviously, you only got 3 choices for control, but will be interesting to see if, especially we've seen Atlanta now testing a sub-base hard point. They've been trying out some of the S&D maps too. So it will be interesting to see when we get on LAN here how different the maps Atlanta are playing compared to what they've been playing recently, because it could be a case of them just like, you know, testing out this stuff, and now we get to LAN, they're like, all right, we're taking the kid gloves off and we're playing our best maps. Or it's just a case of, that hasn't been what's happening, and we'll have to see when we get to the event this week.
Next match, Seattle versus LAG. Big match, especially for LAG, because they're on the outside looking in. They needed this after they went 6-0 in map count, 2-0 in the matches last week. They had a huge week beating Boston and Vegas. Obviously, the competition not incredible. Neither of those teams have been the hottest or the most consistent of teams, but they had a big week last week, hoping to kind of roll that in to their only match of the week this weekend. They end up losing 3-1. Seattle, they split their matches, go 1-1, which is big for them considering that kept them on pace with Miami, who had beaten them earlier in the weekend. So both of these teams are now done with the online portion. Seattle tied for 5th place with Miami, as we mentioned a little bit earlier. And LAG, they are tied for 10th place at 140 points. So they're 10 points back from the Vegas Legion and Carolina Royal Ravens in 8th place. Any takeaways from Seattle closing out the season on a high note?
Nah, I mean, it's obviously a pretty close search there. Went round 11, but other than that, the 2 hard points weren't exactly close. So, pretty more indicative of what we've seen from Seattle of late, probably since like I don't know what you want, if you want to group in the last set of qualifiers a major or not, but certainly in this set of qualifiers, feels like Seattle is one of those teams that have been playing a little better recently than we've seen earlier in the season, or just at different points. And I mean, you could probably write a novel at this point about Seattle season just because of all the twists and turns. But yeah, I mean, good way to end out their portion of the online season for sure. And we don't got to look at it now, but I mean, there's obviously a time when Seattle used to be known for farming those LAG bucks or whatever. Wasn't that what Octane
Something
used to
like
say?
that.
I think, yeah. Um, I would love to be able to look up what Seattle and LAG's all-time record is. It might be similar to LAG's record against LAT in the Battle of LA in terms of how lopsided it is, but probably something we can do another day.
Yes, if people are just kind of following the CDL and they weren't following it at the beginning, Seattle and LAG are historically two of the worst teams in the CDL, and Seattle pretty much did not win matches unless it came against the Los Angeles Guerrillas in the first few seasons of the CDL. Obviously, things changed a little bit with Pred and Sib and the roster from the last two seasons, but certainly it was not happy going for the Seattle Surge when they had Octane in them. And then we have come to the most important match of the entire weekend, OpTic Texas versus the Boston Breach. A match after our hearts, I would say. We have talked at length about the Boston Breach, and we have talked quite a bit about OpTic Texas this season. And, deservedly so for both of those teams. OpTic, obviously the Major 3 champions, and I think I crowned them the favorites to win champs at some point after Major 3. That is no longer the case in Boston. Obviously, the sole owners of the longest losing streak in CDL history. That is also not the case. Well, it is the case, but they're not on that streak anymore because this weekend on Saturday, the Boston Breach broke their losing streak. They go down 2-1 to OpTic Texas. They win the first S&D, but lose the first two respawn maps. And then make a comeback on Rio Hardpoint, win 250 to 233. And then they absolutely smoke OpTic Texas on Rio Search and Destroy 6-1 to snap, I believe it was a 15-match losing streak, if I'm not mistaken. A ridiculous losing streak. And now, obviously, credit to Boston. This is a huge moment for their franchise to at least get. We were very much concerned they would not win another match for the rest of the season. I was not expecting it to come against OpTic of all teams, but it's happened, and congratulations. I'm not sure. It's kind of like the Browns going 0-16 and throwing the parade after that. That kind of feels like what's going on here. Boston has broken a streak that shouldn't have existed in the first place. But the bigger story, obviously, is OpTic. They are, at this point, they were 1-5 in the qualifiers. They have been atrocious. I think you can say they're in the same boat as Boston in the sense that Boston kept losing matches in Game 5. They were very competitive throughout series, but they would ultimately lose in Game 5. And with OpTic, it has kind of been eerily similar that they've had these really, really competitive matches, but they've lost Game 5s. And they have not lost a bunch of Game 5s to super stiff competition. Granted, they did lose to New York, but they also lost to Carolina, and obviously losing to the Boston Breach is a huge, huge red flag. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this? And I think the title of the podcast is something like, is OpTic season over? And obviously they can turn it around theoretically, but this is the absolute worst time to have this kind of slump. And I'm very concerned, in a sense, about if this is the end of their season, if they can even break out of this slump. So what do you think?
I mean, obviously the short answer is no, it's not the end of OpTic season. I still, they are going to be champs no matter what. If they, I guess you could realistically make the argument that they could, in theory, lose their first match here at Major 4 to get a top 12 finish, and they could lose their first two matches at champs and get eliminated, losing 3 straight series like that. I just don't think that's what's going to happen. I just think this team has too much talent on it, and that's what's really been the mind-blowing part for me is I can't think of another team, especially in the CDL era, that coming off of winning a championship has struggled this mightily in the online portion, or just whatever follows like immediately after winning that said title. And this OpTic team in particular, I mean, literally at the start of these qualifiers, we were having the debate of whether OpTic was the best team in the game now. If I know I was saying like like a 1A 1B situation with Atlanta. Um, Now, obviously, the way Toronto's playing, they've entered themselves in that conversation too. So it's just for OpTic, I'm really not sure what to make of this going on. But obviously, this is like the last straw. Like you can't, with how much talent OpTic has on that team, this is just a match you can't lose, no matter how mightily you're struggling or what's going on. And it feels like something has to be going on behind the scenes to me. And obviously we're never going to know, or most likely won't know unless some of the players tell us what's going on and whatnot. But just feels like this would be something you might expect for a newer team, like at the start of a season, not towards the end or after you win a championship, right? Like if this team that has the Shotzi and Dashy duo brings in Pred and Kenny and they struggle at the start of the season, you can be like, yeah, it's taking some time for them to work on how they want to play together and whatnot. You could probably make that argument. But after they have won a championship together, for it to happen, it's really just I really am at a loss for words. I'm not entirely sure what to make of it. And I know I've seen some stuff on the timeline, people like saying like Pred lays down too much when he's playing, and I even saw like I think it was like a clip of like the OpTic Twitter saying like Hex like addressing people saying like the team's getting complacent. Hex is like, unless you've ever won something, you can't say whether they're being complacent or not. So I feel like there's just a lot of people talking right now about what is potentially going on with OpTic, and we just don't have any real solid answers other than the fact that they are struggling at the worst time they could be struggling. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, so I really don't know what's going on. But maybe it's a case of these online matches. They just need to put them in the rearview mirror, and they get back on land and they're able to showcase that talent and do what they were capable of doing, which is literally winning a title on this game a month ago. So yeah, I really don't know what to make of the OpTic situation, but obviously, the search and destroy is just a team losing searches to a team like Boston. Losing a series to Boston is pretty unacceptable at this point in the season, especially after winning a championship and then losing to a team that's on a historic losing streak. Just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And losing searches to a team that is also losing a ton of searches very recently is just it's really hard for me to wrap my head around it. So I'm not sure what's going on. Hopefully we get some answers here at the upcoming major. We maybe see a return to form when they're back on land and they're able to put whatever's been happening behind them. But I'm just not entirely sure what to expect anymore.
I said this I think on the last podcast. It would be different if OpTic was losing consistently to Atlanta, to Toronto, to New York, and they're losing game fives. Like, of course, that's not a good thing, but you could at least reason and say, well, those are really, really good teams. Those are championship contenders that you're losing to. It happens at times. You can kind of get in a little bit of a funk, and things aren't breaking your way. It's like that excuse is up. Like there's no excuse for losing to the Boston Breach. Like, and that is all disrespect, to Boston. Like they have been atrocious, and it's not even like when they were getting in these game fives, like a month or so ago, where they were just losing all the time. They've actually been much worse lately. They haven't been forcing nearly as many game fives. They haven't been able to get to game fives. So that, to me, says so much about where OpTic is right now. Of course, Boston could have played the best match of their lives. They really didn't. Like, it wasn't, I didn't get the feeling like, oh man, like Boston is, so much better today than they were, the last, whatever, 10 weeks of the season. They looked like they have looked for a while. Or at least they used to look. They were able to win, a map or two maps maybe that they kind of sneak it out and they're able to force a game 5. But in every other scenario, they lost that game 5. They weren't able to win those search and destroys. And now OpTic is in that seat of having to sit and say, well, they're kind of moralizing these losses, saying like, well, I see the fans saying like, I think they're just tired of online matches. It's like, dude, everybody is tired of online matches. You don't like Toronto. Scrappy literally said, now we just have matches that mattered. Do you think Atlanta FaZe, who has literally never not been the number 1 seed after a CDL regular season, do you think that they're getting to the Major 4 online qualifiers and like, man, I can't wait to play these online matches against the Las Vegas Legion or whoever they're playing? Like, that's ridiculous. Of course, the best teams are just itching to get to land to Major 4 to champs. But they're still winning. FaZe and Toronto have won, all but 1 or 2 games or matches in these qualifiers. So I don't think that holds up. And I think anybody saying, well, Pred lays down too much, I don't think he's changed his play style that much from when they won Major 3, 4 weeks ago. So let's be real clear on that. Like, this team has issues, but it's not that Pred lays down too much. Maybe they are complacent. That's completely unfair. Hex mentioned, like you really can't say if you're not in the lobby, in the practices. And I did see, I think it was JP. He said that they're working harder than ever to kind of figure out what's going on and try to get back. And of course, that's what he should say, and that's what they should be doing. I'm just kind of. I don't know what the problem is. Like, I can't diagnose the issue with this team. Maybe it is, the latest patch or the latest meta shift that's kind of thrown them off. But like, they're supposed to be a good enough team to be able to kind of roll with the punches and be able to move things around or to adjust in a way that they're able to beat teams like the teams that they've lost to in these qualifiers. The Las Vegas Legion, who hadn't won, I think, in a while, or maybe they had won 1 match in the previous like 4 or 5 weeks. The Minnesota Rocker, who I had said was like on the verge of death at one point. They looked so uninspired. The Carolina Royal Ravens, who we've talked about all season long, that they win some matches that they probably shouldn't, but they also lose matches that they probably should win. And of course, the Boston Breach are kind of like, it's the cherry on top of that. They are the worst team in the CDL and probably the second worst team in CDL history. And they were in the midst of the longest losing streak in CDL history. To lose to a team like that, like, there's no excuse. And like, obviously we're not OpTic fans. Like, we're not like sitting here. We got the scratch or the Shotzi jersey and the OpTic hat or anything, but it is kind of like, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, I'm almost offended by how bad they've been, because, and one last thing I'll say is, OpTic had this kind of thing happen last year to a different extent. They looked incredible. They get second at Major 4 last season. And then they go undefeated in the Major 5 qualifiers. They're the number 1 seed heading into Major 5. What do? They lay an egg. They go 0-6 at Major 5. They lose to Florida, and I think they lost to LAT, who LAT were not in a good place at that time. They lose to those matches. They get eliminated with a top 12 finish at Major 5. They go into champs ice cold. There's a very good chance that something similar happens this year, and for it to happen twice back-to-back years, I don't know what that says about the team. I don't know what that says about the coaching staff, but it's something that if they don't have the desired result at champs like they did last year, I mean, people have to take a really, really good look at what's happening with the team, because there's way too much talent for them to be losing to the Boston Breach in the last weekend of online qualifiers. Anything else before we move on? So, Vegas, Minnesota. not much, and not as nearly as much to talk about with that match. Vegas closes out Saturday with a 3-0 win over the Rocker. Not particularly close. The Control obviously went to game 5 or to round 5, but Vegas takes care of business, which is, I guess, a really big win considering they had lost to LAT earlier in the weekend. Any thoughts on this? Because we did both pick Vegas to win.
Yeah, that's all I was going to really say is that this was one, especially given Vegas' loss earlier in the week, it was a must-win, as close to a must-win. The team below them in the standings that they just, need to take care of business against, and that's what they were able to do. So the Vegas' winning champs crew has got a glimmer of hope now with this win heading into the major, but we'll be talking about them more later too.
And then we go to Sunday, OpTic versus Toronto. OpTic, they don't go to game 5, so they break out of that funk, but they lose 3-0 to the Toronto Ultra. Their S&D losing streak extends to double digits, 10 straight search and destroy losses. Their last search and destroy win was June 2nd, so nearly 3 weeks ago. They won game 2 against the Las Vegas Legion in round 11. So it's been a while, and it's not been very good. Obviously, Toronto finishes out the online season on a high note. Toronto, they clinched the number 1 seed as a result of tiebreaker. They go 6-1 in the qualifiers. And OpTic, the Major 3 champions, will begin Major 4 in the losers bracket as the 12th seed because they lose the tiebreaker to the Boston Breach as a result of the head-to-head. Any thoughts on Toronto and OpTic?
No, I mean, this just goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, where it's like, at one point just a couple weeks ago, we were talking about OpTic and Atlanta at the top. Now, just a few weeks later, totally different scenario where it's Toronto seemingly at the top, Atlanta potentially somewhat close, but behind them. And then, can you even say OpTic's the third best team with the way they've played lately? I don't know. But it's really, just again, just not really sure what to make of the situation for OpTic. If you gave me if you were you had to name 5 teams that could potentially go 1-6 in these Major 4 qualifiers, wouldn't have picked OpTic. I guess the only way in a scenario where you were gonna have me pick them, if you were okay, you got to pick between the top 4 who's gonna go 1-6 in these qualifiers, and even then I probably would say New York over the other definitely 3, right? So it's there really aren't a ton of scenarios where I could have envisioned this being the world we live in, but that's just what scenario we're in now, and it's really really mind-blowing. And I keep saying that, I keep repeating myself, but I'm just at a loss of words. And I thought it was funny. Obviously Ace has to throw jabs when he can. And it was funny earlier in the week too on the timeline, he picked Boston to beat OpTic in the breaking point pick 'em, and him and Octane did it. It was funny that they were right, but yeah, Aches tweeted today, OpTic fans, I know you're stressed right now, but I have some good news for you. This isn't the first time a team fell off and went winless in S&D during June right before COD champs. Now, I'm not saying they can do it, but take solace in the fact it has been done. And he's obviously mentioning or referencing his own World War II Evil Geniuses team, which he screenshot the tweet from JP all those years ago. Mentioning that EG lost 12 straight S&D maps before COD champs, and then of course he had to show the picture of him on stage in Columbus, where you and I actually met in person for the first time and got to witness Ace lifting the trophy for the second time in his career. But yeah, so that was kind of a humble brag, or however you want to phrase it, that he was kind of just throwing a jab there, saying I don't think you guys can do what I did, but it has been done before, so not all hope is lost. I thought that was kind of funny.
Gotta love Patty P. He's never not one. Well, obviously he's kind of he's kind of having a big moment with the shots. He's not a superstar with these qualifiers, but we'll see how things shake out to end the season. And then we had Carolina versus Boston and LAT versus New York. Carolina beating Boston. The only thing I would say about the OpTic Toronto thing is like it would be a lot more concerning and confusing if OpTic had won this after beating or after losing to Boston.
Very, very
Um,
true.
but Carolina ends up beating Boston as we both expected them to do, at least going into the week. Um, I don't know. Like this is a big win for the Ravens, obviously, because they're in that spot where they need all of these wins. They're now heading into Major Four. They're tied for eighth place, but I believe they're on the outside looking in as a result of a tiebreaker with the Las Vegas Legion. So I wouldn't say they're like in a great position necessarily because it's obviously not awesome to lose out as a result of tiebreaker, but they have they can do anything they want. They can make champs if they win enough matches. Like the teams in front of them very likely are not going to win Major Four. They're not going to make deep runs. At least one of them. So if Carolina is able to really get maybe 2 wins would maybe just be enough. I think they could do it, but obviously a big win here to beat Boston. Any thoughts on that game?
Yeah, I think this is one. Obviously, we'll kind of lump in the final match here too. This was a
Yeah.
scenario, I believe, where if Carolina won this match and LAT lost to New York, that Carolina would have gotten a winners bracket spot uh, for Major Four, and Carolina takes business on their end. New York goes up 2-0 over LA Thieves, and especially the first power point was pretty convincing, 250 to 129. Got to be thinking that, Carolina was pretty happy. Like, yeah, New York just got to close this out. We got a winner's bracket spot. LAT pull off the reverse sweep, clinching a winner's bracket spot for themselves and keeping Carolina down in the losers bracket. Pretty big win for LAT over New York, all things considered, too. Um, but yeah, it feels like another scenario here of Clay, like, we mentioned it just before we went on broadcast too, that it's kind of like they were tied with LAG in the standings for these qualifiers, and Carolina played LAG earlier in I believe the first week of these Major Four qualifiers and lost. So it's literally, I know I said at the time that like this is one that you can look back on if you're Carolina, and it could be the difference between you making champs. Now they're looking back on that one match could realistically is realistically the difference between them starting Major Four in the losers bracket and or starting in winners, and that's a tough pill to swallow, especially when you're in this position fighting for the chance to be in champs. So it's another season of Clay's back against the wall towards the end, and he's got to make some magic happen here on land to end the season. Or I know you were talking about it. We could be potentially this upcoming week looking at what might be the final event of Clayster's career. Obviously, that's just speculation. He hasn't said anything about retiring or whatnot, but guy's been playing for a long time. It's gonna happen eventually, and we don't know when it'll be, but it's at least a thought. Like he's potentially playing for, uh, you know, the rest of what could end up being the last time on land.
Yeah.
I personally don't think it is, unless it's just a world where people just don't. He doesn't get an offer from a team next year, but um, that's we'll be talking about that enough over the months after the season actually wraps up. I think right now though, definitely Carolina's got their backs against the wall. They tried to do what they could on their end today. It obviously would have been much different conversation if they lost to Boston too. But yeah, end of the day, the journey ahead of them is tougher than it might have been if they were able to clutch up earlier in these qualifiers. But now you gotta, online portion's done. Gotta focus up on these land matches, and especially starting the losers bracket, you gotta try and just take it one match at a time, because realistically, every match they play going forward now could be their last match of the year.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so a lot to unpack, obviously, with these qualifiers as we go into Major Four. Just a quick look at the Major 4 qualifier standings. Toronto and Atlanta tied for first. Toronto gets the first seed as a result of the tiebreaker. And then there was a 5-way tie for third place. They were all
I
4
didn't
and
even notice
3.
that.
Yeah, so Seattle, LAT, Miami, Vegas, and New York all finished 4 and 3 in these qualifiers. As a result of, like a combined head-to-head tiebreaker, all of those things. The way it shook out is Seattle in third, LAT in fourth, Miami in fifth, Vegas in sixth, and New York in seventh. And then, like you mentioned, LAG, they sneak the into the winners bracket of Major 4 as a result of another tiebreaker. They were tied for eighth with the Carolina Royal Ravens at 3 and 4. LAG, they won 3-2 against Carolina earlier in these qualifiers. So that gets them the eighth spot. So Carolina gets ninth. Minnesota at 2 and 5 gets 10th. And then there's a tie for 11th and 12th between Boston and OpTic, two teams that definitely were not going to pair together at the beginning of these qualifiers. But as a result of head-to-head, obviously Boston gets 11th and OpTic gets 12th. Now moving to Major 4. I actually think the 10th seed was the worst seed to have in these qualifiers because that team, Minnesota, will likely, I think, play Atlanta versus New York. They'll play the loser of that match. That seems like by far the worst outcome of any of those winners bracket matches. And I'll try to pull up Major 4 bracket in just a minute, but let me just quickly run through the winners bracket matches. Obviously, we have Atlanta versus New York. That should be the match to see in the winners bracket round 1. But we also have Toronto versus LAG, LAT versus Miami, and Seattle versus Las Vegas. I assume you're in the same boat as I, that Atlanta versus New York is the big marquee matchup of winners bracket round 1.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really argue against that. I feel like Seattle and Vegas, just because we've seen that recently, and they're probably, I don't know, it's tough. Because I feel like even though Atlanta and New York are closer in the standings, it's a match that I expect Atlanta to win, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like we were talking about Seattle earlier. The Seattle and Miami match, the Seattle versus Vegas match is kind of one where you could say you pick either team. I could pick the other, and I wouldn't really think much of it. It's one match I feel like you could almost flip a coin for. It could go either way. So maybe in terms of a match that I expect to be super close, might go that way, but obviously, yeah, Atlanta and New York is two of the top teams all year, despite what we've seen recently from them. But yeah, I think you look at, especially you look at the bracket, the bottom half is certainly much stronger in my eyes because of that Atlanta New York matchup. So you look at Toronto, their position, I feel pretty confident in saying I would expect to see Toronto in the winners bracket finals, just because I expect them to take care of business against LAG, and they should be able to take down whoever they have to face off against between LAT and Miami.
Yeah, so it's just a really, like, I would say Atlanta versus New York in terms of like skill level, definitely the most exciting, because obviously New York, the talent level is insane, that they just haven't been able to kind of put it together completely this season. But matches like LAT versus Miami or Seattle versus Vegas, those are going to be like really interesting because of the standings. We get to see basically some of these seasons will be kind of hinged on these matches, like a team like LAT losing that match to Miami and then dropping down, and I believe they would play OpTic in that losers round 1. That is like worst case scenario for them. Obviously they're very capable of beating OpTic, especially if OpTic continues to play how they have recently. But ultimately, like that's a scenario like we saw with Vegas last year, where that's that's horrible luck. You really want to win at least one match here just to give yourself some breathing room. And if there's any kind of tiebreakers or whatnot, like it's just going to be huge for them if they can get that win against Miami. And then what else happens after that, then, it's whatever. But I think if a team like LAT, a team like Miami, Seattle, maybe Vegas could be the exception to that. I think if those teams win their first round matchup, obviously only two of them can, they probably make it into champs simply because, Boston, Minnesota, Carolina are all in the losers bracket. Very likely that, obviously Boston's not making it to champs. Like, we can dispel the myth that they have a shot. Like, I literally think they have to win Major 4 and have something happen in front of them for them to get to champs. So, like, there's no way that happens. But Carolina, Minnesota, one of those teams will very likely not make it. Then just kind of comes down to which of those teams in the winners bracket kind of lose out on a really good spot and don't get champs. Just a really interesting major that we're here to finish the season. I will say, just looking at the standings real quick, or the full standings for the season, the top four teams solidified. Atlanta, certainly there could be movement between the top three. Atlanta is 35 points ahead of Toronto. Toronto is 35 points ahead of OpTic. So those teams could, shuffle around depending on what happens at Major 4. But all of those teams plus New York are already guaranteed spots at champs regardless of what happens this weekend. It's just all about seeding for them. But with Miami and Seattle, they're tied for 5th. Only 5 points behind them are LAT in 7th. And then there's Vegas and Carolina tied for 8th. Vegas right now, like I said just a little bit ago, has the tiebreaker. And then LAG and Minnesota are tied for 10th at 140 points. So they're only 10 points behind Vegas and Carolina, and only 25 points behind LAT. So, I think a matchup like Miami and LAT, that's the 5th seed or the 5th, 6th seed versus the 7, that could really hinge on, or that could really make or break one of those teams' seasons. But we should probably just do our predictions, right? We should kind of push through, and I think both of us are not going to pick against Toronto. I think we're both going to go with the Ultra against the Gorillas. Then there's LAT versus Miami, and I'm leaning LAT, and I'll probably go with them, but the Heretics have looked as solid as they have for the last 4 or 5 months, and I think that gives me a lot of confidence for them. Even if they drop down the losers bracket, that they could probably give OpTic a little bit of a fight or more of a fight than they have in the past. So, but I'll go with LAT.
I'll go with Miami.
Okay.
Pull for the Vamos, make sure we got something different. But also, it is a little interesting. We've talked at length now this season about the former Florida Mutineers, slash OpTic rivalry, or curse, whatever you want to phrase it as, is long dead. It would be pretty poetic if LAT did win this match, Miami drops down, and then they're finally able to beat OpTic in the event after OpTic won an event to hand them a last place finish. That would be kind of interesting, but at the same time, Miami wins this match, we get an HBR Classic, and the potential, if OpTic shows up, for OpTic to, in theory, end LAT's season if they, obviously if they lose 2 matches like that at this event. A realistic chance that if some other things don't go their way, they might miss out on champs, right? So a lot of implications here in terms of just winning that first match between LAT and Miami, in terms of who could potentially be at champs and who might miss it. But I'll go with the Vamos for now and take Miami in this one.
And then there's Atlanta versus New York. I think we're both going to go with Atlanta.
Yep.
And then Seattle versus Vegas. I'm going to go with Seattle. I have a hard time picking either of these teams, but it just seems that Surge might be a little bit better. They might have a little more of an advantage. I don't really think that anyone can actually pick either of these teams with a lot of confidence.
Yep, and I'm gonna go with Vegas for the Vegas is winning champs crew, and surely they won't let me down again, right?
I mean, they're in the driver's seat. They weren't last year. I think if I remember correctly, they were like tied or like 10 points behind like Seattle and Minnesota, and they needed, certain things to break their way. And I think they lost to Minnesota. So like something like that could happen, where I don't think they can play Carolina necessarily, but I mean, if they lost to Seattle and then they lost to Boston and like Carolina ends up winning a match or something, that's literally the worst thing that could possibly happen.
I will say, just thinking about it now, that way the bracket shakes out, we were talking earlier about that Carolina and LAG match that potentially cost them the bracket spot. In hindsight, obviously the way tiebreakers would have worked with different records might not have played out this way, but regardless, if things go according to plan and Toronto does take care of business, Carolina has another shot against LAG with their season on the line. That makes for a pretty good storyline in terms of potential losers bracket matchups there. So I'm kind of excited for that one.
Yeah, so if LAG loses to Toronto as we expect them to, and then they drop down to play Carolina, like you said, the winner of that match gets 15 points instead of 10. So just playing it out right now, LAG is 10 points behind Carolina. Obviously, if Carolina loses without winning a match, like their season's over because they're the losers of the tiebreaker right now. But LAG winning that match would put them 5 points ahead of Vegas if Vegas loses to Seattle, which would make LAG the last team in champs at that point. Obviously, Vegas, they have their opportunity. They play Seattle, and even if they end up losing, they play Boston. So winning either of those matches would very likely clinch them a spot at champs, or do a lot to get them to that point. But I think that's something that honestly, Carolina versus LAG could be the most interesting matchup of the losers bracket. Obviously, Boston, anytime they're playing, I'm kind of interested, kind of in a morbid curiosity way. And, I just don't see Minnesota really being a big force for Atlanta or New York in the losers bracket.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, you could probably make a case for all three of these, or I'm sorry, not all three, but three of the four losers bracket matchups having like some strong storyline attached to them if they go the way we think they will go, aside from Minnesota, because no matter who Minnesota plays between Atlanta and New York, you got to expect the team from the winners bracket to take that one after dropping down, and that likely means Minnesota's season will end there. But, stranger things have happened before, so we'll have to wait and see. But that is, potentially Carolina versus LAG. Really excited for that. OpTic versus either of those teams in Thieves or Miami has some potential, especially banking or just depending on which OpTic we get, right? And then Boston versus either Seattle or Legion. The way Boston has played this year, it would be almost like the most Boston thing of late for them to, finally win on land and end one of those two team seasons, right? So yeah, pretty jam-packed with some good storylines here to round out the season, as you'd expect for the final regular season event when so much is still on the line.
Yeah, there are definitely going to be a lot of storylines, definitely a lot of intrigue around who makes it to champs. I don't think we're ever going to get as interesting of a run as we did with New York in, what was that, 22?
Yeah.
Where they're pretty much dead last, and then they somehow rise from the dead to make champs at the last event. Technically Boston would, they're able to do that. I don't think that's going to happen. Call me, pessimistic, but I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there.
But yeah, that is so New York right now, they are the only team that's locked into their seed. So regardless of what happens this weekend, they're going to be the 4th seed. And it just kind of depends on how everything else shakes out. Again, we have 5 through 8. Those are up for grabs. and we'll see what happens with the top three. If OpTic can break out of their losing streak and figure out what's going on, and finish out the regular season on a high note. But it's going to be a very, very tough weekend for quite a few of these teams. Obviously, we'll see not half the league, a quarter of the league. Their season will end in an instant, essentially, and we'll kind of do a eulogy of sorts next time we see them. So we could talk about those teams on our next episode. Who do you think is going to win Major 4? I think this is kind of like the least, I wouldn't say it's like the least predictable, but it's like the least dramatic for sure. Just because at the end of the day, like it isn't. I don't know. Like it feels like the intrigue about the event is with the bottom 8 and not the top
Yeah.
4 now. So who do you think wins?
Yeah, no, I would say the same thing in terms of like I definitely am more tuned into who's making champs, right? It kind of takes away from just how well Toronto has been playing now recently, despite us keying in on maybe their search and destroy woes and whatnot. I feel like my mind is saying Toronto, especially just because Toronto just most recently beat FaZe and OpTic. Like they should be considered the favorites. I'll go with Atlanta just for the sake of going with Atlanta and, never really picking against Atlanta. But I feel like the smart pick is Toronto, and they should probably be considered the favorites to take it all. But yeah, outside of like one of these lower teams just going on an absolutely unprecedented run to um, solidify their champ spot and take the whole event, I really, definitely a good shout by you that like the winner of this actual tournament is going to be like a footnote almost.
Yeah, and I should mention that the last 2 years, the winner of the final major ended up winning champs. Because
Ooh.
in 2022, we had LAT, they won Major 4, they end up winning the championship. And then New York last year wins the final major, and then they go to champs and they win that as well. So, like, it certainly is a momentum builder, and it's a good litmus test because it's literally 2 weeks before champs. You get the idea of like who's the best on LAN in this meta at this point in time against these specific opponents. Like the rosters won't change, so it gives you like a really good idea of who or kind of how these teams rank in relation to each other. I think you obviously have to go with Toronto because they've been able to beat Atlanta. They've been able. I don't know if OpTic will even really come into play. Obviously, OpTic did give Toronto trouble at the last major, but OpTic would have to really get a far way to get to Toronto. And even New York, I'm not entirely sure what to make of them at this point. So yeah, I think Toronto is definitely who I'm going with. But it seems like every time I don't pick FaZe that they end up winning, so I fully expect that to happen again. Any dark horse, if outside of the you can actually include OpTic here too, but outside of New York, Atlanta, and Toronto, who is the most likely winner?
I mean, you got to go with OpTic, right? Like, all I'll say is that will be an absolutely banger episode from us next week. If after these last couple weeks of OpTic just struggling, us not knowing what to make of them, they just go on a historic losers bracket run and take the whole thing. Yeah. Has a team ever won an event that started in losers? I feel like the answer is no. Like,
I don't think so.
In the CDL era.
No.
Yeah.
Because it's like a team like LAG lost round 1 and then won Major 2 a few years ago.
I was going to say, I think New York did that.
Yeah, but they're almost always starting in the winners bracket.
Yeah.
I can't think of one that literally was like dead in the water to start and just came out.
No. Yeah, I can't either. So all I'll say is, if that's what we get next week, we're going to have a ton to talk about, and it will be a banger episode from us. I'm not going to put it past OpTic. I will say one thing we did mention either last episode or a couple of weeks ago. This fourth major is going to be in California, no crowd, no fans in attendance, and obviously that is something. The green wall is a huge part of just OpTic and their support always, they're the loudest most of the time, pulling for their squad and whatnot. So that's definitely something that plays against OpTic when it's an event that has no fans. Um, but at this point, just the way they've played recently online, that's the least of their concerns. But I mean, if you gotta go with any team as a quote unquote dark horse, I guess I'll take OpTic. Other than that, I really can't think of uh, any of these teams really having a chance, because like the way the top bracket is looking, like I would probably say a team like Surge or Vegas or Miami or LAT, like those other teams starting in those winners bracket matchups against each other, they obviously have a good shot to advance because they're not playing against Toronto, FaZe, OpTic, or New York, right? But then they inevitably have to play, again, unless LAG just pull off a massive upset and throw the bracket in complete disarray. Even if they win their first round matchup between LAT, Miami, Seattle, and Vegas, they're gonna have to play Toronto or FaZe/New York. So, really no strong path for upsets there, unless one of those teams just catches fire. And if that's the case, we'll have even more exciting stuff to talk about next time we're live.
Yeah, I think obviously OpTic is the dark horse if you can consider them one. I was just looking at their potential path. So obviously they would play the loser of LAT and Miami. Either way, I think that's a winnable match for them. Then they would play the winner of Carolina versus probably LAG. That's a very winnable match for them. Then they would play the loser of probably like Atlanta versus Seattle or Atlanta versus Vegas. Probably Seattle or Vegas in that scenario. Winnable match for them. And then they're into the winners the losers semifinals. And who knows at that point? Like then you're on to like Saturday, you're on to Sunday, and then you really have like you can theoretically see the path because they are such a talented team. But I agree, like there's a reason that it hasn't happened, or that it, if it has happened, it's happened so infrequently that even we can't remember that it's happened. It's incredibly difficult to not have any slip ups and to obviously be coming in on such a low note, and that's what OpTic is facing right now.
Yeah, I feel pretty confident. I can't even say it really confidently, but
fairly.
I'm what I'm gonna say. I feel like it's definitely, especially the way you just laid it out with those matchups that OpTic has in front of them. Again, they're not, unless there's a major upset, they are most likely not gonna play Toronto, FaZe, or New York before like top 6.
Yeah.
So I could realistically see OpTic making it to Sunday, but it's just, again, it's going to come down to, are they really able to put what's happened in these online matches behind them? Are they really able to learn from these losses and recent struggles? Or are they just going to show up on LAN here and be the same team that struggled over these last few weeks? Conversely, or are they going to be the team that shows up and was the team that won Major 3? So a lot of questions around OpTic, and we're just gonna have to wait and see which form they show up in.
I think other than OpTic, I would probably go with LAT as my dark horse, simply because I think they're one of the better S&D teams. I think if Breaking Point's standings are correct, they have the third highest S&D win percentage this season behind Atlanta and New York. So obviously S&D wins championships. I don't feel super confident about it, but if they were able to beat Miami, which I think I predicted them to, and I think they're very much capable of that, then it comes down to beating most likely Toronto. And while that's not an easy stretch or an easy task by any means, Toronto has had those S&D troubles in the past, in the very recent past, and then after that you kind of can extend the momentum and whatnot. But I agree with you, it's not very likely any of these teams outside of Toronto, Atlanta, and to a certain extent New York win. I would say that obviously most of my thought process is going for Toronto, and that's who I think is going to win. But there's still a considerable portion for Atlanta. And then there's a little bit for New York just based on the talent. And then there's like a little teeny bit for OpTic, and thinking that maybe if any team can pull off a miracle like that, it is this OpTic team. Who do you think wins MVP? Who's winning Major 4 MVP?
I mean, I picked Atlanta, so I'll go with my boy Sal. If Toronto wins, I'll go with Kleenex. Kleenex has been frying, and I feel like they've been mentioning on the broadcast too, like in control, he's really just been popping off. So I'll give Toby the shout there.
I'm going with Toronto. I think Scrap won Major 1 MVP. No, Kleenex won.
Kleenex did, yeah.
Major 1 MVP. So I'll go with Scrap. I think usually they don't typically repeat, and there's not always like a clean cut answer for these MVP winners, because it really is all about how you kind of finish and how you show up in the grand final. So I'll go with Scrap. But it would be crazy if it was Toronto and FaZe to end the season. That's kind of how I want it to end. If we can't get some kind of ridiculous story like OpTic making it all the way to grand finals from the losers bracket. But we will see. There's obviously a ton of storylines, a ton of angles to watch out for this weekend. If you want, you can watch Major 4 on YouTube, on the Call of Duty League YouTube channel. And we will be back next week to talk about it all, to talk about who made it to champs, who didn't make it to champs, who performed up to their standard, who underperformed at Major 4, and all that good stuff. Please remember to like and subscribe and follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Give us a 5-star rating at Apple Podcasts. We're also on Spotify, Google Podcasts, all that good stuff. Follow us on Twitter at GBink with 2 Ks. Freudian slip, I don't know. At Preston Byers podcast. Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. And we will be back, like I said, early next week. Typically live show on Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday. We'll see what happens. But the best way to keep up to date is to follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening, if you're watching on YouTube, if you subscribe, you follow it, you will get notifications when we upload the podcast, when we have a new episode for you, and that's certainly the best way to do it. But we'll be back then to talk about everything that happened at Major 4 and to kind of wrap up the CDL regular season as we gear toward the final event of the year, CDL Champs. But that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah. Oh, thank you guys as always for all the support. We appreciate it. Obviously, like I said at the beginning of the show, this is the official end of the online portion of the MW3 season. So for those who have been with us along this entire journey this year, thank you guys for all the support and for sticking with us through some of these grueling weeks of endless qualifiers between teams that some people probably didn't want to sit there and watch play an online match that seemingly didn't mean much. But yeah, we're getting to the end here. Got one more LAN and then champs. So hopefully you guys stick with us for the rest of the way, and we'll see you when we're live again. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.